How do you? I'm doing alright. A bit tired. Because I woke up like 55 minutes ago. I have some hot chocolate and some jammy dodgers. Haha, for breakfast. Because I apparently hate my whole body. A mood. Okay. Well, yesterday when I was coming home from work, I decided to nip into a shop and just buy those like little pre-made cups of hot chocolate. So it's not like premium hot chocolate; it's like 89p hot chocolate. I've never really liked Lemsip. I don't know what it is. Like I've tried adding like sweeteners and honey and all sorts, and I just can't like it. So I just kind of suffer when I have a bad throat. Yeah. The only throat thing that I like is cherry soothers. But like warm drinks will break it up anyway. Oh cool, I didn't burn my tongue. Sweet. You'll hear me like clearing my throat all the time because when I wake up I have like just the worst. It's always still the worst. I feel so bad for you. Jesus. Yeah, I would straight hate. Soothers are great. I love soothers. Sometimes I'll buy them even when I'm not sick because they just taste too good. I probably shouldn't, but they taste really nice. Ah yes, croaky morning voice. Normally I give myself like an hour and a half to actually wake up. But I didn't do that this morning. I got up, I had my indigestion tablet, I had a vitamin, and then I've just made myself a hot chocolate and some jammy dodgers. I mean, yeah, it's bad, but I wanted to do the stream because it's fun. We can be a frog choir together, Chaos. I also want to drink like all my hot chocolate before it goes cold. Because I do have like a bottle of juice as well. I forgot about my Actimel. Hold on, I'm just gonna like down that real quick. A thing I like to do during winter months is getting Actimel because my immune system is notoriously shit. I think I've like gently singed my tongue because I'm drinking something cold and my tongue is going. What are you doing? My audiobook substitute. Yeah, I'll be your audiobook substitute. Actimel is wonderful. The only flavour I like of it is strawberry, which is weird because I hate strawberry and like everything else. Actimel is like the only thing I can have strawberry in. It might be a bit more than a sickness at this point. You might have like tonsillitis or something. I had tonsillitis once. They gave me massive antibiotics And I was sat there like, I can barely swallow. What makes you think that I'm going to be able to take these? And it's just, I just, I drink a lot of water with it. I'm like, you assume my throat's going to open up enough to get it down. Interesting. Oh my god. Yeah, no. I won't be able to deal with that. Though, one time my mum did tell me about a story when I was, a wee bairn, a small child, where I had an ear infection and they gave me that banana flavoured penicillin, and apparently it upset my stomach so much that I got gastrointestinal problems. That was like, oops. Out the hospital with an ear infection, back in the hospital for the world's worst stomach pains. Oh yeah, dry your hair. Dry your hair before you get all squared. All cubed. A wee bairn. We're far up enough north that I feel like I can gently take some Scottish language. Yeah, my entire digestive tract is just a shit. I'll be honest with you. Like, I have really bad acid reflux. Like, so bad that I have to take tablets. I have to take acid inhibitors of a morning so that I don't eat myself alive. Genuinely feel like a dragon whenever I run out and I have to eat that day. And whenever I don't eat, actually, my stomach is just like, oh, by the way. I always keep my hairbrush handy. I really do. Oh, yeah. Eating disorders suck. I think I have like an oddly shaped stomach, or like one of my stomach valve doesn't work right as well. So that explains the acid reflux if the valve isn't shutting properly. But I've mentioned it to my doctors and like none of them really do anything about it. Like, well, yeah, you just have to be on medication for the rest of your life. I don't want to be on medication for the rest of my life. I like waking up and having to take a tablet. I have to wait 30 minutes to an hour before I can eat. I'm starving by the time I wake up. They do. They do. Yeah, my odd shaped stomach. So like when I eat, I don't actually feel that full until like I've overeaten basically. So like I'm pretty much always hungry, and that sucks. Cause like I can eat and eat and eat and just keep eating, and I'm like I need to stop, just keep eating. I feel like look at the time and go, how long has it been since I've last eaten? And then I go, oh, I last ate at 12, and it's like 4:30. Yep, it's free, but it's shit. But they were weirdly good with like helping me sort out my flat foot problem. Like, I mean, then again, that still has like a really long waiting list. You know. The exact opposite. Oh, I do love being the exact opposite of people. I I think we're at the point of the book where we have um uh, yeah, I do believe we're at the part of the book where David does fun things. I think that's the next chapter though. It's been like forever since I've read this book, like entirely. I completely forgot about the entire preamble, because my brain starts the book when the fun things happen. You don't have to say for once. I imagine there's plenty of times when you're going to be quiet. And I like it when people talk to me. It makes me feel loved and appreciated. But while you're drying your hair, I'll be reading, because we're like 17 minutes into the session, 18 minutes into the session, and I should probably just fucking start, really. So, let me get the starting soon off, because we're starting now, bitches! I didn't mean that. You're all lovely people. And thank you for joining me at 10 o'clock in the morning. Or 3 o'clock in the morning, Fable's here. So. Well, Chaos, I'll be real with you. I don't think I've ever met you, like, in real life. But I'm also never quiet, either. So, we'd probably just sit there and chat up a storm. And it'd be great. Okay. Chapter 5 of Intruders and Transformations. The Crooked Man finally crossed over into David's world at the start of September. It had been a long, tense summer. His father spent more time at his place of work than he did at home, sometimes not sleeping in his own bed for 2 or 3 nights in a row. It was often too difficult for him to return to the house anyway once night fell. All of the road signs had been removed to thwart the Germans if they invaded, and on more than one occasion David's father had managed to get lost while driving home in daylight. If he tried driving at night with his headlamps off, who knew where he might end up? Rose was finding motherhood difficult. David wondered if his own mother had found it as hard, if David had been as demanding as Georgie seemed to be. He hoped not. The stress of the situation had caused Rose's tolerance for David and his moods to sink lower and lower. They barely talked to each other now, and David could tell that his father's patience with both of them was almost extinguished. At dinner the night before, he had exploded when Rose had taken an innocuous remark of David's as an insult, and the two of them had begun to bicker. "Why can't you two just find a way to get along, for crying out loud?" his father had shouted. "I don't come home for this. I can get all the tension and shouting matches I want at work." Georgie, seated in his high chair, started to cry. "Now look what you've done," said Rose. She threw her napkin down on the table and went to Georgie. David's father buried his head in his hands, not his hands in his head, that would be weird. "So it's all my fault," he said. "Well, it's not mine," replied Rose. Simultaneously, their eyes turned towards David. "What?" he said. "You're blaming me? Fine." He stomped away from the table, leaving his dinner unfinished. He was still hungry, but the stew was mainly vegetables, with some nasty pieces of cheap sausage spread through it to break the monotony. He knew that he'd have to eat the rest of it tomorrow, but he didn't care. It wasn't going to taste any worse reheated than it already did. As he headed for his room, he expected his father's voice demanding that he return and finish his food, but nobody called him back. He sat down hard on his bed. He couldn't wait for the summer holidays to be over. A place had been found for David in a school not far from the house, which would at least be better than spending every day with Rose and Georgie. David was not seeing Dr. Mobley quite as often, mainly because nobody had time to take him into London. Anyway, the attacks had stopped, or so it appeared. He no longer fell to the ground or experienced blackouts, but something far stranger and more unsettling was now occurring. Stranger than even the whispering of the books, to which David had grown almost accustomed. David was experiencing waking dreams. That was the only way he could find to describe them to himself. It felt like those moments late in the evening when you were reading or listening to the radio, and you grew so tired that for an instant you fell asleep and started dreaming. Except obviously you didn't realize you'd fallen asleep, so the world suddenly seemed to become very peculiar. David would be playing in his room, or reading, or walking in the garden, and everything would shimmer. The walls would disappear, the book would fall from his hands, the garden would be replaced by hills and tall, grey trees. He would find himself in a new land, a twilight place of shadows and cold winds, heavy with the smell of wild animals. Sometimes he would even hear voices. They were somehow familiar as they called to him, but as soon as he tried to concentrate on them, the vision would end and he would be back in his own world. The strangest thing of all was that one of the voices sounded like his mother's. It was the one that spoke loudest and clearest. She called to him from out of the darkness. She called to him, and she told him that she was alive. The waking dreams were always strongest near the sunken garden, but David found them so disturbing that he tried to stay away from that part of the property as much as possible. In fact, so troubled was David by them that he was tempted to tell Dr. Mobley about them, if his father could make time for an appointment. Perhaps he would finally tell him about the whispering of the books too, David thought. The two might be linked, but then he thought of Dr. Mobley's questions about David's mother, and remembered once again the threat of being put away. When David talked to him about missing his mother, Dr. Mobley would talk in turn about grief and loss, about how it was natural, yet you had to try to get over it. But being sad about your mother dying was one thing. Hearing her voice crying out from the shadows of a sunken garden, claiming to be alive behind the decaying brickwork, was quite another. David wasn't sure how Dr. Mobley would respond to that. He didn't want to be put away, but the dreams were frightening. He wanted them to stop. It was one of his last days at home before school recommenced. Tiring of the house, David went for a walk in the woods at the back of the property. He picked up a big stick and scythed at the long grass. He found a spider's web in a bush and tried to tempt the spider out with fragments of small sticks. He dropped one close to the center of the web, but nothing happened. David realized it was because the stick wasn't moving. It was the struggles of the insect that alerted the spider, which made David think that perhaps spiders were a lot cleverer than anything so small had a right to be. And he is correct. Spiders are terrifying. He looked back at the house and saw the window of his bedroom. The ivy growing on the walls. The ivy growing on the walls almost surrounded the frame, making his room look more than ever like a part of the natural world. Now that he saw it from a distance, he noticed the ivy was thickest at his window. It had barely touched any of the other windows on this side of the house. It had not spread across the lower parts of the wall either, the way ivy usually did, but had climbed straight and true along a narrow path to David's window, like the beanstalk in the fairy tale that led Jack to the giant. The ivy seemed to know precisely where it was going. And then Then a figure moved inside David's room. He saw a shape pass by the glass, dressed in forest green. For a moment he was certain that it must be Rose, or perhaps Mrs. Briggs. But then David remembered that Mrs. Briggs had gone down to the village, while Rose rarely entered his room, and if she did, she always asked his permission first. It wasn't his father either. The person in the room was the wrong shape for him. In fact, David thought, whoever was in his room was the wrong shape, full stop. I disagree, they can't even clock the room. I mean, fair, but at the same time, these bad boys play music on their webs and understand where things are on their webs in correlation to the vibrations that they make, which is wild to me. Yeah, and also they're small enough to live in your walls. No, thank you. Like, if you're going to live in my house, at least pay rent. You know? I'm gonna have a small drink break. I've only read like 3 pages out loud, and my voice already hurts. The figure was slightly hunched, as though it had become so used to sneaking about that its body had contorted, the spine curving, the arms like twisted branches, the fingers clutching, ready to snatch at whatever it saw. Its nose was narrow and hooked. It wore a crooked hat upon its head. It disappeared from sight for a moment before it reappeared holding one of David's books. The figure flipped through the pages before it found something that interested it, whereupon it paused and seemed to start reading. Then, suddenly, David heard Georgie crying in his nursery. The figure dropped the book and listened. David saw its fingers extend into the air, as if Georgie were hanging before it like an apple ready to be plucked from the tree. It seemed to be debating with itself as to what to do next, for David saw its left hand move to its pointed chin and stroke it softly. While it was thinking, it glanced over its shoulder and down towards the woods below. It saw David, and froze for an instant before dropping to the floor. But in that moment, David saw coal black eyes set in a pale face so long and thin that it seemed to have been stretched on a rack. Its mouth was very wide, and its lips were very, very dark, like old, sour wine. David ran for the house. He burst into the kitchen where his father was reading the newspaper. "Dad, there's someone in my room," he said. His father looked up at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "There's a man up there," David insisted. "I was walking in the woods and I looked up at my window and he was there. He wore a hat and his face was really long. Then he heard the baby crying and stopped whatever he was doing and listened. He saw me looking at him and he tried to hide. Please, Dad, you've got to believe me." His father's brow furrowed, and he put the paper down. "David, if you're joking, I'm not. Honestly." He followed his father up the stairs, the stick still clutched in his hand. The door to his room was closed, and David's father paused before opening it. Then he reached down and twisted the knob. The door opened. For a second, nothing happened. "See," said David's father. "There's nothing—" Something struck his father in the face, and he shouted loudly. There was a panicked fluttering and a banging as whatever it was bounced against the walls and the window. Once the initial shock had gone away, David peered around his father and saw that the intruder was a magpie. Its feathers a blur of black and white as it tried to escape from the room. "Stay outside and keep the door closed," said his father. "They're vicious birds." "Magpies aren't vicious. They're lovely. I do love magpies." David did as he was told. Reader's thoughts aside. Although he was still frightened, he heard his father open the window and shout at the magpie, forcing it towards the gap, until finally he could hear the bird no longer, and his father opened the door, sweating slightly. "Well, that gave both of us a fright," he said. David looked into the room. There was some feathers on the floor, but that was all. There was no sign of the bird, or the strange little man he had seen. Slight tangent for a second. I have cats. One of my cats came in one day. I heard the world's amount of shuffling and panic noises from downstairs. I went downstairs. Feathers everywhere. There was only a pigeon, a live pigeon, in the house. One of the cats had chased a live pigeon into the house. And this, kids, is why you don't let your cats go outside. Oh dear, indeed, chaos. He went to the window. The frog. Oh dear. There was no sign of the bird or of the strange little man he had seen. He went to the window. The magpie was perched on the crumbling stonework of the sunken garden. It seemed to be staring back at him. "It was only a magpie," said his father. "That's what you saw." David was tempted to argue, but he knew his father would tell him that he was being silly if he insisted that something else had been in here, something far bigger and far nastier than a magpie. Magpies didn't wear crooked hats or reach out for crying babies, but David had seen its eyes, and its hunched body, and its long, grasping fingers. He looked back at the sunken garden. The magpie was gone. His father sighed theatrically. "You still don't believe that was only a magpie, do you?" he said. He went down on his knees and checked under the bed. He opened the wardrobe and looked in the bathroom next door. He even peered behind the bookcases, where there was a gap barely large enough to accommodate David's hand. "See," said his father. "It was just a bird." But he could see that David remained unconvinced, so together they searched all of the rooms on the top floor, and then the floors below, until it became clear that the only people in the house were David, his father, Rose, and the baby. Then David's father left him and returned to his newspaper. Back in his room, David picked up a book from the floor by his window. It was one of Jonathan Tulvy's storybooks, and it lay open at the tail of Red Riding Hood. The story was illustrated by a picture of the wolf towering over the little girl, Grandma's blood on its claws, and teeth bared to consume her granddaughter. Someone, presumably Jonathan, had scribbled over the figure of the wolf with a black crayon, as though disturbed by the threat it represented. David closed the book and returned it to its shelf. As he did so, he noticed the silence in his room. There was no whispering. All of the books were quiet. "I suppose a magpie could have dislodged that book," thought David. But a magpie couldn't enter a room through a locked window. Someone else had been there, of that he was sure. In the old stories, people were always transforming themselves, or being transformed, into animals and birds. Couldn't the crooked man have changed himself into a magpie in order to escape discovery? He hadn't gone far, though. Oh no. He'd flown only as far as the sunken garden, and then he had disappeared. As David lay in bed that night, caught between sleeping and waking, his mother's voice carried to him from the darkness of the sunken garden, calling his name, demanding that she should not be forgotten. And David knew then that the time was quickly approaching when he would have to enter that place and face at last what lay within. Papi. Chapter 7. That's not 7, that's 6. I can read Roman numerals, I promise. Of the war and the way between worlds. Ooh. David and Rose had their worst fight the next day. It had been coming for a long time. Rose was breastfeeding Georgie, which meant that she was forced to rise during the night in order to take care of his needs. But even after he was fed, Georgie would toss and turn and cry, and there was little that David's father could do to help, even when he was around. It sometimes led to arguments with Rose. They usually began with a little thing, a dish that his father forgot to put away, or dirt tracked through the kitchen on the soles of his shoes, and quickly developed into shouting matches that would end with Rose in tears and Georgie echoing his mother's cries. David thought that his father looked older and more tired than before. He worried about him. He missed his father's presence. That morning, the morning of the big fight, David had stood at the bathroom door and watched his father shave. "You work really hard," he said. "I suppose so. You're tired all the time. I'm tired of you and Rose not getting along." "Sorry," said David. Said his father. He finished shaving, wiped the lather from his face with water from the sink, then dried himself with a pink towel. "I don't see you that much anymore," said David. "That's all. I miss having you around." His father smiled at him, then cuffed him gently on the ear. "I know," he said. "But we all have to make sacrifices, and there are men and women out there who are making much greater sacrifices than we are. They're putting their lives at risk every day, and I have a duty to do all I can to help them. It's important that we find out what the Germans are planning and what they suspect about our people. That's my job. And don't forget that we're lucky here, having a much more difficult time of it in London." The Germans had struck hard at London the day before. At one point, according to David's father, there'd been 1,000 aircraft battling over the Isle of Sheppey. David wondered what London looked like now. Was it filled with burnt-out buildings, with rubble where streets used to be? Were there pigeons still on Trafalgar Square? He supposed that they were. The pigeons weren't clever enough to move somewhere else. Perhaps his father was right that they were lucky to be away from it. But part of David thought again that it must be quite exciting to live in London now. Frightening, sometimes, but exciting. "In time, it will come to an end, and we can all go back to living normal lives," said his father. "When?" asked David. His father looked troubled. "I don't know. Not for a while. Months? Longer, I think." "Are we winning, Dad?" "We're holding on, David. At the moment, that's the best we can do." David left his father to get dressed. They all ate breakfast together before his father left, but Rose and his dad said little to each other. David knew they had been fighting again, so when his father left to work, he decided to stay out of Rose's way even more than usual. He went to his room for a while, played with his soldiers, then later lay in the shade at the back of the house to read his book. It was there that Rose found him. Although his book was open on his chest, David's attention was focused elsewhere. He was staring at the far end of the lawn where the sunken garden lay, his eyes fixed on the hole in the brickwork, as though expecting to see movement within. "So there you are," said Rose. David looked up at her. The sun was in his eyes, so he was forced to squint. "What do you want?" he asked. He hadn't meant it to come out the way it did. It sounded as if he was being disrespectful and rude, but he wasn't, or no more than he ever was. He supposed that he could have asked, "What can I do for you?" or even have a prefix, "yes," or "certainly," or just "hello," to what he had said. But by the time he thought of this, it was too late. Rose had red marks under her eyes. Her skin was pale, and it looked as if there were more lines on her forehead and face than there had previously been. She was heavier, too, but David supposed that was to do with having the baby. He had asked his father about it, and his father told him to never, ever mention it to Rose, no matter what. He had been very serious about it. In fact, he used the words, "more than our lives are worth," to stress how important it was that David keep such opinions to himself. Now Rose, fatter and paler and more tired, was standing beside David, Even with the sun in his eyes, he could see the anger rising in her. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she said. "You sit around all day with your head buried in your books, and you contribute nothing to life in this house. You can't even keep a civil tongue in your head. Who do you think you are?" David was about to apologize, but he didn't. What she was saying wasn't fair. He'd offered to help with things, but Rose nearly always turned him down, mostly because he seemed to catch her when Georgie was acting up, and when she had her hands full with something else. Mr. Briggs took care of the garden, and David always tried to assist him with the sweeping and raking, but that was out of doors, where Rose couldn't see what he was doing. Mrs. Briggs did all of the cleaning and most of the cooking, but whenever David tried to lend her a hand, she shooed him out of the room, claiming that he was just one more thing for her to trip over. It had simply seemed to him that the best option was to stay out of everyone's way as much as possible. And anyway, these were the last days of his summer holidays. The village school had postponed opening for a couple of days because of a shortage of teachers, but his father seemed certain that David would be behind his new desk by the start of the following week at the very latest. From then until half-term, he would be in school during the day and doing homework in the evenings. His working day would be nearly as long as his father's. Why shouldn't he take it easy while he could? Now his anger was growing to match Rose's. He stood up and saw that he was just as tall as she was. The words poured from his mouth almost before he knew that he was speaking them, a mixture of half-truths and insults and all of the rage that he had suppressed since the birth of Georgie. "Now, who do you think you are?" he said. "You're not my mother, and you can't talk to me like that. I didn't want to come here to live. I wanted to be with my dad. We were doing just fine by ourselves, and then you came along. Now there's Georgie too, and you think I'm just someone who's in your way. Well, you're in my way, and you're in my dad's way. He still loves my mom just like I do. He still thinks of her, and he's never going to love you the way he loved her. Not ever. It doesn't matter what you do or what you say, he still loves her. He still loves her." Rose hit him. She struck him on the cheek with the palm of her hand. It wasn't a hard slap, and she pulled the blow as soon as she realized what she was doing, but the impact was still enough to rock David on his heels. His cheek smarted, and his eyes watered. He stood, open-mouthed with shock, then brushed past Rose and ran to his room. He didn't look back, not even when she called after him and said that she was sorry. He locked the door behind him and refused to open it to her when she knocked on it. After a while, she went away and did not return. David stayed in his room till his father came home. He heard Rose speak to him in the hallway. His father's voice grew louder. Rose tried to calm him down. There were footsteps on the stairs. David knew what was coming. The door to his room was almost blown off by its hinges, by the force of his father's fists upon it. "David, open this door. Open it now." David did what he was told, turning the key once in the lock, then stepped back hurriedly as his father entered. His father's face was almost purple with fury. He raised his hand as if to hit David, then seemed to think better of it. He swallowed once, took a deep breath, then shook his head. When he spoke again, his voice was strangely calm, which worried David more than the previous show of anger. "You have no right to speak to Rose in that way," said his father. "You will show respect to her, just as you show respect to me. Things have been hard for all of us, but that does not excuse your behaviour today. I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do with you, or how you're to be punished. If it wasn't already too late, I'd pack you off to boarding school, and then you'd realise just how fortunate you are to be here." David tried to speak, but his father raised his hand. "I don't want to hear about it. If you open your mouth again, it will go hard with you. For now, you will stay in your room. You will not go outside tomorrow. You will not read, and you will not play with your toys. Your door will remain open, and if I catch you reading or playing then, so help me, I will take a belt to you. You will sit there on your bed, and you will think about what you said, and about how you're going to make it up to Rose when you're eventually allowed to return to life with civilized people. I'm disappointed in you, David. I brought you up to behave better than that. We both did, your mum and I." With that, he left. David sank back on his bed. He didn't want to cry, but he couldn't stop himself. It wasn't fair. He had been wrong to talk to Rose that way, but she had been wrong to hit him. As his tears fell, he became aware of the murmuring of the books on his shelves. He had grown so used to it that he almost ceased to notice it, like birdsong or wind in the trees. But now it was growing louder and louder. A burning smell came to him, like matches igniting and tramways sparking. He clenched his teeth as the first spasm came, but there was nobody to witness it. A great fissure appeared in his room, ripping apart the fabric of this world, and he saw another realm beyond. I'm going to take a break to have another drink. I'm sorry. There was a castle, with banners waving from its battlements, and soldiers marching in columns through its gates. Then that castle was gone, and another took its place, this one surrounded by fallen trees. It was darker than the first, its shape unclear, and it was dominated by a single great tower that pointed like a finger towards the sky. I mean, I do need to stay hydrated. my throat dies rather frequently. Its topmost window was lit, and David felt a presence there. It was at once both strange and familiar. It called to him in his mother's voice. It said, "David, I'm not dead. Come to me and save me." David did not know how long he had been unconscious, if sleep had at some point taken over, but his room was dark when he opened his eyes. There was a foul taste in his mouth, and he realized that he had been sick on his pillow. He wanted to go to his father and tell him of the attack, but he felt certain that there would be very little sympathy for him from that quarter. Anyway, there was not a sound to be heard in the house, so he assumed that everyone was in bed. The waning moon shone upon the rows of books, but they were now quiet again, apart from the occasional snore that arose from the duller, more boring volumes. It was a history of the cupboard, abandoned and unloved upon a high shelf, that was particularly uninteresting. It had the nasty habit of snoring very loudly, and then coughing thunderously, at which point small clouds of black dust would appear to rise from its pages. David heard it cough now, but he was aware of a certain wakefulness among some of the older books, the ones that contained the strange, dark fairy stories he loved so much. He sensed that they were waiting for an event to occur, although he could not tell what it might be. David was certain that he had been dreaming, although he could not quite recall the substance of the dream. Of one thing he was sure: the dream had not been a pleasant one, but all that remained was a lingering feeling of unease and tingling on the palm of his right hand, as though it had been stroked with poison ivy. There was the same sensation on the side of his face. He could not shake off the feeling that something unpleasant had touched him while he was lost to the world. He was still wearing his day clothes. He climbed out of bed and undressed in the dark, changing into clean pyjamas. He returned to his bed and wrestled with his pillow, turning this way and that in an effort to find a comfortable position in which to go to sleep, but no rest came. Well, sweetie, it might help if you cleaned your pillow first. Just a thought. As he lay with his eyes closed, he noticed that his window was open. He didn't like it to be open. It was hard enough to keep the insects out even when it was closed, and the last thing he wanted was for the magpie to return while he was sleeping. David left his bed and carefully approached the window. Something curled over his bare foot, and he raised it in shock. It was a tendril of ivy. There were shoots of it along the inner wall, and green fingers extended over the wardrobe and the carpet and the chest of drawers. He had spoken to Mr. Briggs about it, and the gardener had promised to get a ladder and trim back the ivy from the outside wall, but so far that hadn't happened. David didn't like touching the ivy. The way it was encroaching on his room made it seem almost alive. David found his slippers and placed them on his feet before walking across the ivy to close the window. As he did so, he heard a woman's voice speak his name. "David?" "Mum?" he asked uncertainly. "Yes, David, it's me. Listen, don't be afraid." But David was afraid. "Please," said the voice, "I need your help. I'm trapped in here. I'm trapped in this strange place, and I don't know what to do. Please come, David. If you love me, come across." "Mum," he said, "I'm frightened." The voice spoke again, but it was fainter now. "David, they're taking me away. Don't let them take me from you. Please, follow me and bring me home. Follow me through the garden." Heckin' fairies. And with that, David overcame his fear. He grabbed his dressing gown and ran as quickly and as quietly as he could, down the stairs and out onto the gates. He paused in the darkness. There was a disturbance in the night sky, a low, irregular put-putting noise that came from high above. David looked up and saw something glowing faintly in the dark, like a meteor falling. It was an aeroplane. He kept the light in view until he came to the steps that led to the sunken garden, taking them as fast as he could. He didn't want to pause, because if he paused he might think about what he was going to do. And if he began thinking about it, he might become too afraid to do it. He felt the grass crumple beneath his feet as he ran to the hole in the wall. Even as the light in the sky grew brighter, the aeroplane was now flaming redly, and the noise of its sputtering engines tore through the night. David stopped and watched it descend. It was dropping fast, shedding burning shards as it came. It was too big to be a fighter. This was a bomber. He thought he could make out the shape of its wings and hear the desperate thrumming of the remaining engines as the plane fell to earth. It grew larger and larger, until at last it seemed to fill the sky, dwarfing their house, lighting up the night with a red and orange fire. It was heading straight for the sunken garden, flames licking at the German cross on its fuselage, as though something in the heavens above was determined to stop David from moving between realms. The choice had been made for him. David could not hesitate. He forced himself through the gap in the wall and into the darkness just as the world that he left behind became an inferno. Should just start hydrating between chapters, shouldn't I? Now we're on chapter 7. The bricks and mortar were gone. There was now rough bark beneath David's fingers. He was inside the trunk of a tree, an arched hole before him, beyond which lay shadowy woods. Leaves fell, descending in slow spirals to the forest floor. Thorny bushes and stinging nettles provided low cover, but there were no flowers that David could see. It was a landscape composed of greens and browns. Everything appeared to be illuminated by a strange half-light, as though dawn was just approaching, or the day was at last drawing to its close. Also, chapter 7 is called Of the Woodsman and the Work of His Axe. I've just remembered that I forgot to read that bit out. It's still morning for me. It was a landscape composed of greens and browns. Everything appeared to be illuminated by a strange half-light, as though dawn was just approaching, or the day was at last drawing to its close. David stayed in the darkness of the trunk, unmoving. His mother's voice was gone, and now there was only the barely heard sound of leaf glancing against leaf and the distant rushing of water over rocks. There was no sign of the German plane, no indication that it ever even existed. He was tempted to turn back, to run to the house and wake his father in order to tell him of what he had seen. But what could he say? and why would his father believe him after all that had occurred that day? He needed proof, some token of this new world. And so David emerged from the hollow of the tree trunk. The sky above was starless, the constellations hidden by heavy clouds. The air smelled fresh and clean to him at first, but as he breathed deeply, he caught a hint of something else, something less pleasant. David could almost taste it upon his tongue. A metallic sensation composed of copper and decay. It reminded him of the day that he and his father had found a dead cat by the side of the road, its fur torn and its insides exposed. The cat had smelled a lot like the night air in the new land. David shivered, only partly from the cold. Suddenly, he was aware of a great roaring noise from behind him, and a sensation of heat at his back. He threw himself to the ground and rolled away as the trunk of the tree began to swell and distend, the hollow widening until it resembled the entrance to a great, bark-lined cave. Flames flickered deep within it, then, like a mouth expelling a tasteless piece of food, it spat forth the burning fuselage of the German bomber, the body of one of its crew still trapped in the wreckage of the gondola beneath, its machine gun pointing at David. The wreckage tore a blackened, burning path through the undergrowth before it came to rest in a clearing, still spewing smoke and fumes as the flames fed upon it. David stood, brushing leaves and dirt from his clothing. He tried to approach the burning plane. It was a Ju-88. He could tell from the gondola. He could see the remains of the gunner, now almost entirely wreathed in flames. He wondered if any of the crew had survived. The body of the trapped aviator lay pressed against the cracked glass, his mouth grinning white in his charred skull. David had never seen death up close before, not like this, not violent and smelly and turning to black. He could not help thinking of the German's final moments, trapped in the searing heat, his skin burning. He experienced a wave of pity for the dead man whose name he would never know. Something whizzed by his ear, like the warm passage of a night insect, followed almost immediately by a cracking noise. A second insect buzzed past, but by then David was already lying flat on the ground, crawling for cover as the ammunition from the 303 ignited. He found a depression in the earth and threw himself into it, covering his head with his hands and trying to keep himself as low as he could until the hail of bullets had ceased. Only when he was certain that the ammunition was entirely spent did he dare to raise his head again. He stood warily and watched as flames and sparks shot into the skies above. For the first time, he got some sense of how huge were the trees in this forest, taller and wider than even the oldest of oaks in the woods back home. Their trunks were grey and entirely without branches until, at least 100 feet above his head, they exploded into massive, mostly bare crowns. A black, box-like object had separated from the main body of the wrecked plane and now lay, smoking slightly, not far from where David stood. It looked like an old camera, but with wheels on its side. He could make out the word Blickwinkel marked on one of the wheels. Beneath it was a label reading Auf Fabriks 1. It was a bomb site. David had seen pictures of them. This was what the German flyers had used to pick out their targets on the ground. Perhaps that had even been the task of the man who now lay burning in the wreckage, for the city would have passed beneath him as he lay prone on the gondola. Some of David's pity for the dead man seeped away. The bomb site made what they had been doing seem more real, somehow more awful. He thought of families huddled in their Anderson shelters, the children crying and the adults hoping that whatever descended would strike far away from them, Other crowds gathered together in the underground stations, listening to the explosions, dust and dirt falling on their heads as the bombs shook the ground above. And they would be the lucky ones. He kicked out hard at the bomb site, connecting with a perfect right foot shot. He felt a surge of satisfaction as he heard the sound of broken glass from within and knew the delicate lenses had shattered. Now that the excitement was over, David put his hands in the pockets of his dressing gown and tried to take in a little more of his surroundings. Some 4 or 5 steps beyond where he was, 4 bright purple flowers stood tall above the grass. They were the first signs of real colour that he had seen so far. Their leaves were yellow and orange, and the hearts of the flowers themselves looked to David like the faces of sleeping children. Even in the murk of the forest, he thought, he could discern their closed eyelids, the slightly opened mouths, and the twin holes of their nostrils. They were unlike any flower he had ever seen before. If he could take one and give it to his father, then he might be able to convince him that this place truly existed. David approached the flowers, dead leaves crunching beneath his feet. He was almost upon them when the eyelids of one of the flowers opened, revealing small yellow eyes. Then its lips parted, and it emitted a shriek. Instantly, the other flowers awoke, and then, almost as one, they closed their leaves around themselves, revealing hard, barbed undersides that glistened faintly with a sticky residue. Something told David that it would be a bad idea to touch those barbs. He thought of nettles and poison ivy. They were bad enough, but who knows what poisons the plants here might have to use to defend themselves. David's nose wrinkled. The wind was blowing the smell of the burning aircraft away from him, and its stench had now been replaced by another. The metallic smell that he had detected earlier was stronger here. He took a few steps deeper into the forest and saw an uneven formation under the fallen leaves. Spots of blue and red, suggesting something lay barely concealed beneath. It was roughly the shape of a man. David drew closer and saw clothing and fur beneath it. His brow furrowed. It was like an animal wearing clothing. It was a furry. I'm kidding. It had clawed fingers and legs like those of a dog. David tried to glimpse its face, but there was none. Its head had been clearly severed from the body, and recently too, for a long spray of arterial blood still lay upon the forest floor. David covered his mouth so that he would not be sick. The sight of 2 corpses in as many minutes was making his stomach churn. He stepped away from the body and turned back towards his tree. As he did so, the great hole in the trunk disappeared before his eyes, the tree shrinking to its previous size, while the bark seeming to grow over the gap while he watched, entirely covering the passage back to his own world. It became just one more tree in a forest of great trees, each hardly different from the next. David touched his fingers to the wood, pressing and knocking, hoping to find some way of reopening the portal back to his old life. But nothing happened. He almost cried, but he knew that if he began crying, all would be lost. He would just be a small boy, powerless and afraid, far from home. Instead, he looked around him and found the tip of a large flat rock erupting from the dirt. He dug it free, and using its sharpest edge, he chipped at the trunk of the tree, once, and then again, over and over, until the bark fragmented and fell to the ground. David thought that he felt the tree shudder, the way a person might if he had suddenly experienced a severe shock. The whiteness of the inner pulp turned to red, and what looked very much like blood began to seep from the wound, flowing down the channels and crevasses of the bark and dripping onto the ground beneath. A voice said, "Don't do that. The trees don't like it." David turned. There was a man standing in the shadows a short distance from him. He was big and tall, with broad shoulders and short dark hair. He wore brown boots of leather that came almost to his knees, and a short coat made from skins and hides. His eyes were very green, so he seemed almost like a part of the forest itself, given human form. Over his right shoulder, he carried an axe. David dropped the stone. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know." The man regarded him silently. "No," he said at last. "I don't suppose you did." He advanced towards David, and the boy instinctively took a couple of steps back until he felt his hands graze the tree. Once again, it seemed to shiver beneath his touch, but the feeling was less pronounced than before, as though it were gradually recovering from the injury it had received, and was certain now, in the presence of the approaching stranger, that no such hurt would be visited on it again. David was not so reassured by the man's approach. He had an axe, the kind of axe that looked as if it could sever a head from a body. Now that the man had emerged from the shadows, David was able to examine his face more closely. He thought that the man looked stern, but there was a kindness there too, and the boy felt that here was someone who could be trusted. He began to relax a little, although he kept a wary eye on the big axe. "Who are you?" said David. "I might ask you the same question," said the man. "These woods are in my care, and I have never seen you in them before. Still, in answer to you, I am the woodsman. I have no other name, or none that matter." The woodsman approached the burning aeroplane. The flames were dying down now, leaving the framework exposed. It looked like the skeleton of some great beast, abandoned to the fire after the roasted meat had been stripped from its bones. The gunner could no longer be seen clearly. He had become just another dark shape in a tangle of metal and machine parts. The woodsman shook his head in wonder, then walked away from the wreckage and returned to David. He reached past the boy and laid his hand upon the trunk of the wounded tree. He looked closely at the damage David had inflicted upon it, and then petted the tree as one might pat a horse or a dog. Kneeling down, he removed some moss from the nearby stones, which he packed into the hole. "It's all right, old fellow," he said to the tree. "It will heal soon enough." Far above David's head, the branches moved for a moment, even though all of the other trees remained still. The woodsman returned his attention to David. "And now," he said, "it's your turn. What is your name? And what are you doing here? This is no place for a boy to be wandering alone. Did you come in this thing?" He gestured towards the aeroplane. "No, that followed after me. My name is David. I came through the tree trunk. There was a hole, but it disappeared. That's why I was chipping at the bark. I was hoping to cut my way back in, or at least to mark the tree so I'd be able to find it again." "You came through the tree?" he asked. "From where did you come?" "A garden," said David. "There was a little gap in a corner, and I found a way through from there to here. I thought I heard my mother's voice, and I followed it. Now the way back is gone." The woodsman pointed again at the wreckage. "And how did you come to bring that in with you?" "There was fighting. It fell from the sky." If the woodsman was surprised by this information, he didn't show it. "There is the body of a man inside," said the woodsman. "Did you know him?" "He was the gunner of one of the crew. I'd never seen him before. He was a German." "He's dead now." The woodsman touched his fingers to the tree once again, lightly tracing its surface as though hoping to find the telltale cracks of a doorway beneath his skin. "As you say, there is no longer a door here. You were right to try and mark this tree, even if your methods were clumsy." He reached into the folds of his jacket and removed a small ball of rough twine. He unravelled it until he was satisfied that he had the correct length, and tied it around the trunk of the tree. From the small of the bag he produced a grey sticky substance that he smeared on the twine. It didn't smell at all nice. "It'll keep the animals and birds from gnawing upon the rope," he explained to the woodsman. He picked up his axe. "You'd better come with me," he said. "We'll decide what to do with you tomorrow, but for now we need to get you to safety." David didn't move. He could still smell blood and decay on the air, and now that he had seen the axe at close quarters, he thought he spotted drops of red along its length. There were red marks too on the man's clothing. "Excuse me," he said, as innocently as he could, "but if you care for the woods, why do you need an axe?" The woodsman looked at David with what might almost have been amusement. As though he saw through the boy's efforts to conceal his concerns, yet was impressed by his guile nonetheless. "The axe isn't for the woods," said the woodsman. "It's for the things that live in the woods." He raised his head and sniffed the air. He pointed the axe in the direction of the headless corpse. "You smelled it," he said. David nodded. "I saw it too. Did you do it?" "I did. It looked like a man, but it wasn't." "No," said the woodsman. "Not a man. We can talk about it later. You have nothing to fear from me, but there are other creatures that we both have reason to fear. Come now. Their time is near, and the heat and the smell of the burning flesh will draw them to this place." David, realizing that he had no other choice, followed the woodsman. He was cold, and his slippers were damp, so the woodsman gave him his jacket to wear, and raised David up onto his back. It had been a long time since someone had carried David upon his back. He was too heavy for his father now, but the woodsman did not appear troubled by the burden. They passed through the forest, the trees seeming to stretch endlessly before them. David tried to take in the new sights, but the woodsman moved quickly, and it was all David could do to hang on. Above their heads, the clouds briefly parted, and the moon was revealed. It was very red, like a great hole in the skin of the night. The woodsman picked up the pace, his long steps eating up the forest floor. "We must hurry," he said. "They'll be coming soon." As he spoke, a great howling arose from the north, and the woodsman began to run. Chapter 8. Of wolves, and worse than wolves. The forest passed, in a blur of grey and brown and fading winter green. Briars tore at the woodsman's jacket and the trousers of David's pyjamas, and on more than one occasion David had to duck down to prevent his face from being raked by high bushes. The howling had ceased, but the woodsman had not slowed his pace, not for a moment. Neither did he speak, so David too stayed silent. He was frightened, though. He tried to look back over his shoulder once, but the effort almost caused him to lose his balance, and he did not try again. They were still in the depths of the forest when the woodsman stopped and seemed to be listening. David almost asked him what was wrong, but then thought better of it and remained quiet, trying to hear what it was that had caused the woodsman to pause. He felt a prickling sensation at his neck as his hair stood on end, and he was certain that they were being watched. Then, faintly, he heard a brushing of leaves to his right, and a snapping of twigs to his left. There was movement behind them, as though presences in the undergrowth were trying to close in on them as softly as possible. "Hold on tight," said the woodsman. "Almost there." He sprinted to his right, leaving the easy ground and breaking through the thicket of ferns, and instantly David heard the woods erupt into noise behind them as the pursuit recommenced in earnest. A cut opened upon his hand, dripping blood onto the ground, and a large hole was ripped in his pyjamas from the knee to the ankle. He lost a slipper, and the night air bit at his bare toes. His fingers ached with the cold and the effort of holding on tightly to the woodsman, but he did not release his grip. They passed through another patch of bushes, and now they were on a rough trail that wound its way down a slope towards what looked like a garden beyond. David glanced behind him and thought he saw two pale orbs gleaming in the moonlight and a patch of thick fur. "Don't look back," said the woodsman. "Whatever you do, don't look back." David faced forward again. He was terrified, and was now very sorry that he had followed the voice of his mother into this place. He was just a boy wearing pyjamas, one slipper, and an old blue dressing gown under a stranger's jacket, and he did not belong anywhere but in his own bedroom. The trees were thinning, and David and the woodsman emerged into a patch of lovingly tended land, sown with row upon row of vegetables. Before them stood the strangest cottage that David had ever seen, surrounded by a low wooden fence. The dwelling was built of logs hewn from the forest, with a door at the centre, a window on either side, and a sloping roof with a stone chimney stack at one end. But that was where any resemblance to a normal cottage ended. Its silhouette against the night sky was that of a hedgehog, for it was covered in spikes of wood and metal, where sharp-ended sticks and rods of iron had been inserted between or through the logs. As they drew closer, David could also make out pieces of glass and sharp stone in the walls, and even on the roof, that it shone in the moonlight, as though sprinkled with diamonds. The windows were heavily barred, and great nails had been driven through the door from the inside, so that to fall heavily against it would be a risk to instant impalement. This was not a cottage. This was a fortress. They passed through the fence, were approaching the safety of the house, when a form appeared from behind its walls and advanced towards them. It resembled a large wolf in shape, except that it wore an ornate shirt of white and gold on its upper body. You sure it's not black and blue? No, white and gold, its upper body, and bright red breeches on its lower half. And then, as David watched, it rose on its hind legs and stood like a man, and it became clear that this was more than an animal, for its ears were roughly human in shape, although tufted with points of hair at the tips, and its muzzle was shorter than a wolf's. Its lips were drawn back from its fangs, and it growled at them in warning. But it was in its eyes that the struggle between a wolf and man was clearest. These were not the eyes of an animal. They were cunning, but also self-aware, and they were filled with hunger and desire. Other similar creatures were now emerging from the forest, some wearing clothing, mostly tattered jackets and torn trousers, and they too rose up and stood on their hind legs. But there were many, many more who were just like ordinary wolves. They were smaller and stayed on all fours, and looked savage and unthinking to David. It was the ones who bore traces of men upon them that frightened David the most. The woodsman lowered David to the ground. "Stay close to me," he said. "If anything happens, run for the cottage." He patted David on the lower back, and David felt something fall into the pocket of the jacket. As discreetly as he could, he allowed his hand to drift towards the pocket, trying to pretend that it was the clothes that made him seek its comfort. He put his hand inside and felt the shape of a large iron key. David closed his fist upon it and held it as though his very life depended on it, which he was starting to realize might well be the case. The wolfman by the house regarded David intently, and so terrifying was his gaze that David was forced to look to the ground, to the back of the woodsman's neck, anywhere but into those eyes that were both familiar and alien. The wolfman touched a long claw to one of the spikes on the cottage walls, as though testing its power to harm, and then it spoke. Its voice was deep and low, and filled with spittle and growls, but David could clearly understand every word that it said. "I see you've been busy, woodsman," it said. "You've been fortifying your lair." "The woods are changing," the woodsman replied. "There are strange creatures abroad." He shifted the axe in his hands in order to improve his grip upon it. If the wolfman noticed the implicit threat, he did not show it. Instead, he merely growled in agreement, as if he and the woodsman were neighbours whose paths had crossed unexpectedly while walking in the evening. "The whole land is changing," said the wolfman. "The old king can no longer control his kingdom." "I am not wise enough to judge such matters," said the woodsman. "I have never met the king, and he does not consult with me about the care of his realm." "Perhaps he should," said the wolfman. He seemed almost to smile, except there was no friendliness to it. "After all, you treat these woods as though they were your own kingdom. You should not forget that there are others who would contest your right to rule them." "I treat all living creatures in this place with the respect they deserve. But it is in the order of things that man should rule over all. Then perhaps it is time for a new order to rise, said the Wolfman. And what order would that be? Asked the woodsman. David could hear mockery in his tone. An order of wolves, of predators. The fact that you walk on hind legs doesn't make you a man, and the fact you wear gold in your ear doesn't make you a king. There are many kingdoms that might exist, and many kings, said the Wolfman. You will not rule here, said the woodsman. If you try, I will kill you and all of your brothers and sisters. The Wolfman opened its jaws and snarled. David trembled, but the woodsman did not move an inch. It seems you've already begun. Is that your handiwork back in the forest? Asked the Wolfman, almost carelessly. These are my woods. My handiwork is all over them. I'm referring to the body of poor Ferdinand, my scout. He appears to have lost his head. Was that his name? I never had a chance to ask. He was too intent upon tearing at my throat for us to exchange an idle chit-chat. The Wolfman licked his lips. He was hungry, he said. We're all hungry. His eyes flicked from the woodsman to David, as they had done for much of the conversation, but this time they lingered a little longer on the boy. His appetites will no longer trouble him, said the woodsman. I've relieved him of their burden. But Ferdinand was forgotten. The Wolfman's attention was now entirely focused on David. And what have you found on your travels? Said the Wolfman. It seems you've discovered a strange creature of your own, new meat from the forest. A long, thin thread of saliva dripped from its muzzle as it spoke. The woodsman placed a protective hand on David's shoulder, drawing him closer, while his right hand firmly remained on the axe. This is my brother's son. He has come to stay with me. The wolf fell to all fours, and the hackles on its back rose high. It sniffed the air. You lie, it growled. You have no brother, no family. You live alone in this place, and you always have. This is no child of our land. He brings with him new sense. He is different. He's mine, and I'm his guardian, said the woodsman. There's a fire in the forest. Something strange is burning there. Did it come with him? I do not know anything about it. If you do not, perhaps this boy does, and he can explain to us where this came from. The Wolfman nodded to one of its fellows, and a dark shape flew across the air and landed close to David. It was the head of the German gunner, all cindery black and charred red. His flight helmet had melted on into his scalp, and once again David glimpsed his teeth still, locked in their death grimace. There was little eating on him, said the Wolfman. He tasted of ash and sour things. Man does not eat man, said the woodsman in disgust. You have shown your true nature through your actions. The Wolfman snapped at the air in disdain. You cannot keep the boy safe. Others will learn of him. Give him to us, and we will offer him the protection of the pack. But the Wolfman's eyes gave the lie to its words, for everything about the beast spoke of hunger and want. Its ribs stuck out against its grey fur, visible beneath the white of its shirt, and its limbs were thin. The others with it were also starving. They were now slowly closing in on David and the woodsman, unable to resist the promise of food. Suddenly, there was a blur of movement to the right, and one of the lower order of wolves, overcome by its appetites, leaped. The woodsman spun, the axe rose, and there was a single sharp yelp before the wolf fell dead upon the ground, its head almost severed from its body. A howling arose from the assembled pack, the wolves twisting and turning in excitement and distress. The wolfman stared at the fallen animal, and then turned on the woodsman, every sharp tooth in its mouth visible, every hackle raised upon its back. David thought that it must certainly fall on them, and then the rest would follow, and they would be torn apart. But instead, the side of the creature that bore traces of something human seemed to overcome the animal half, and it brought its rage under control. It rose once again on its hind leg and shook its head. I warned them to keep their distance, but they're starving, it said. There are new enemies and new predators who compete with us for food. Still, this one was not like us, woodsmen. We're not animals. These others cannot control their urges. The woodsman and David were backing towards the cottage, trying to get closer to the promise of safety that it offered. Do not fool yourself, beast, said the woodsman. There is no us. I have more in common with the leaves on the trees and the dirt in the ground than I do with you and your kind. Already, some of the wolves had advanced and begun to feed on their fallen comrade, but not the ones who wore clothes. They looked longingly at the corpse, but, like their leader, they tried to maintain a veneer of self-control. It did not run deep, however. David could see their nostrils twitching at the scent of blood, and he felt certain that were the woodsman not there to protect him, the wolfmen would have already torn him to pieces. The lower wolves were cannibals, content to feed upon their own kind, but the appetites of the ones who resemble men were much worse than those of the rest. The wolfman considered the woodsman's answer. Masked by the woodsman's body, David had already taken the key from his pocket and was preparing to insert it in the lock. If there is no bond between us, it said, thoughtfully, then my conscience is clear. He looked to the assembled pack. It's time, he snarled, to feed. David fitted the key into the hole and began to turn it, just as the wolfman felt on all fours, its body tensed and ready to spring. A sharp yelp of warning came from one of the wolves at the edge of the forest. The animal turned to face some threat as yet unseen, and it drew the attention of the rest of the pack, so that even their leader was distracted for crucial seconds. David risked a glance and saw a shape moving against the trunk of a tree, coiling around it like a snake. The wolf backed away from it, whining softly. While it was distracted, a length of green ivy extended itself from a low branch and looped itself around the wolf's neck. It cinched tight upon the fur and then yanked the wolf high into the air, the animal's legs kicking in vain as it began to choke. Now the whole forest appeared to come alive in a blur of twisting strands of green, the tendrils curling around legs and muzzles and throats, hauling wolves and wolfmen into the air or trapping them upon the ground, drawing tighter and tighter around them until all struggles ceased. The wolves immediately began to fight back, snapping and snarling, but they were powerless against an enemy like this, and those that could were already trying to retreat. David felt the key turn in the lock as the pack leader's head jerked to and fro, torn between its desires for flesh and its urge to survive. Lengths of ivy were moving in its direction now, creeping across the damp earth of the vegetable patch. It had to choose quickly between fight and flight. With a final growl of fury at the woodsman and David, the wolfman turned tail and ran south. Even as the woodsman pushed David through the gap and into the safety of the cottage, the door closing firmly behind them and sealing off the sounds of howling and dying from the edge of the forest. Drink break. Stay hydrated. Chapter 9 of the loops and how they came into being. David moved to one of the barred windows as a warm orange glow crept through the little cottage. The woodsman had made sure that the door was securely bolted, and the wolves had fled before piling logs onto the stone fireplace and preparing the fire. If he was troubled by what had occurred outside, then he wasn't showing it. In fact, he seemed to be remarkably calm, and some of that calm had spread to David. He should have been terrified and traumatized. After all, he'd been threatened by talking wolves, witnessed an attack by living ivy, and the charred head of a German flyer had landed at his feet, half gnawed by sharp teeth. Instead, he was merely bewildered, and more than a little curious. David's fingers and nose tingled. His nose began to run in the glowing warmth, and he discarded the woodsman's jacket. He wiped his nose on the sleeve of his dressing gown, and then felt a little ashamed. The dressing gown, now looking decidedly sorry for itself, was the only item of outer clothing that he possessed. It seemed unwise to add to its current state of disrepair in any way. Apart from the gown, he had one slipper, a pair of torn, muddy pajama bottoms, and a pajama shirt which, compared with the other items, was almost as good as new. The window at which he stood had been blocked by internal shutters behind the bars, with a narrow horizontal slit to allow those inside to see out. Through the gap, you saw the corpses of wolves being dragged into the forest, some leaving trails of blood behind. They are growing ever bolder and more cunning, and that makes them harder to kill, said the woodsman. He had joined David at the window. A year ago, they wouldn't have risked such an attack upon me, or upon another under my protection, but now there are more of them than ever, and their numbers are swelling with each passing day. Soon, they may try to make good on their promise to take the kingdom. The ivy attacked them, said David. He still could not quite believe what he had seen. The forest, or this forest at least, has ways of protecting itself, said the woodsman. Those beasts are unnatural, a threat to the order of things. The forest wants no part of them. It is to do with the king, I think, and the fading of his powers. This world is coming apart, and it grows stronger with each passing day. The loops are the most dangerous creatures yet to have arisen, for they are the worst of man and beast fighting for supremacy within them. Loops, said David. Is that what you call those wolf things? They are not wolves. Other wolves run with them. Neither are they men, although they walk on two legs when it suits their purposes. Their leader decks himself in jewels and fine clothes. He calls himself Leroy. Leroy. And he is as intelligent as he is ambitious, and as cunning as he is cruel. Now, he would war with the king. I hear stories from travellers through these woods. They talk of great packs of wolves, and moving across the land, white wolves from the north and black wolves from the south, all heeding the call of their brothers, the greys, and their leaders, the loops. And while David sat by the fire, the woodsman told him a story. The Woodsman's First Tale. Once upon a time, there was a girl who lived on the outskirts of the forest. She was lively and bright, and she wore a red cloak, for that way, if she ever went astray, she could easily be found, since a red cloak would always stand out against the trees and bushes. As the years went by, she became more woman than girl. She grew more and more beautiful. Many men wanted her for their bride, but she turned them all down. None was good enough for her, for she was cleverer than any man she met, and they presented no challenge to her. Her grandmother lived in a cottage in the forest, and the girl would visit her often, bringing her baskets of bread and meat, and staying with her for a time. While her grandmother slept, the girl in red would wander among the trees, tasting the wild berries and strange fruit of the woods. One day, as she walked in a dark grove, a wolf came. It was wary of her, and tried to pass without being seen, but the girl's senses were too acute. She saw the wolf, and she looked into its eyes, and fell in love with the strangeness of it. When it turned away, she followed it, travelling deeper into the forest than she had ever gone before. The wolf tried to lose her in places, but there were no trails to follow, no paths to be seen, but the girl was too quick for it, and mile after mile the chase continued. At last, the wolf grew weary of the pursuit, and it turned to face her. It bared its fangs and growled a warning, but she was not afraid. "Lovely wolf," she whispered, "you have nothing to fear from me." She reached out her hand and placed it upon the wolf's head. She ran her fingers through its fur and calmed it. And the wolf saw what beautiful eyes she had, all the better to see him with, and what gentle hands, all the better to stroke him with, and what soft, red lips, all the better to taste him with. The girl leaned forward, and she kissed the wolf. She cast off her red cloak, and put her basket of flowers aside, and she lay with the animal. From their union came a creature that was more human than wolf. He was the first of the Loops, the one called Leroy, and more followed after him. Although women came, lured by the girl in the red cloak, she would wander the forest paths, enticing those who passed her way with promises of ripe, juicy berries and spring water so pure it could make skin look young again. Sometimes she travelled to the edge of a town or village, and there she would wait until a girl walked by, and she would draw her into the woods with false cries for help. But there were some who went with her willingly, for there are other women who dream of lying with wolves. None was ever seen again, for in time the Loops turned in on those who had created them, and they fed upon them in the moonlight. And that is how the Loops came into being. When his tale was done, the woodsman went to an oak chest in the corner by the bed and found a shirt that would fit David, as well as a pair of trousers that were just a little too long and shoes that were just a little too loose, although the addition of an extra pair of coarse wool socks made them wearable. The shoes were leather and had clearly not been worn in a great many years. David wondered where they had come from, for they obviously belonged to a child once, but when he tried to ask the woodsman about them, he just turned away and busied himself with laying out bread and cheese for them to eat. While they ate, the woodsman questioned David more closely about how he came to enter the forest, and about the world that he had left behind. There was so much to tell, but the woodsman seemed less interested in talk of war and flying machines than he was in David and his family and the story of his mother. "You say that you heard her voice," he said, "yet she is dead. So how can this be?" "I don't know," said David, "but it was her. I know it was." The woodsman looked doubtful. "I've seen no woman pass through the woods for a long time. If she is here, she has found another way into this world." In return, the woodsman told David much about the place in which he now found himself. He spoke of the king who had reigned for a very long time, but had lost control of his kingdom as he grew old and tired, and was now a virtual recluse in his castle to the east. He spoke more of the Loops and their desire to reign over others as men did, and of new castles that had appeared in distant parts of the kingdom, dark places of hidden evil. And he spoke of a trickster, the one who had no name, and was unlike any other creature in the kingdom, for even the king feared him. "Is he a crooked man?" asked David, suddenly. "Does he wear a crooked hat?" The woodsman stopped chewing his bread. "And how would you know that?" he said. "I've seen him," said David. "He is in my bedroom." "That is him," said the woodsman. "He steals children, and they are never seen again." And there was something so sad, yet so angry about the way the woodsman spoke of the crooked man that David wondered if Leroy, the leader of the Loops, was wrong. Perhaps the woodsman had a family once, but something very bad happened, and now he was entirely alone. I once again hate to leave you all on a cliffhanger, but I'm doing 5 chapters every time I read, so... So you're either going to have to convince me quite a lot to continue reading, or I can leave it there for the day. Not to be mean or anything. I know it's cruel, but if I keep it to 5 chapters, then my voice doesn't die fast and I can keep reading for you guys. I'm looking at my schedule to see when I can do another one, because we do love ourselves a thing. Hey Abel. I mean, I might be able to read chapter 10, but that would mean I'd be reading 6 chapters every time, and that doesn't feel right, you know? If I read 5 chapters every time, then I read 5 chapters every time, you know? Plus, it is actually starting to get very interesting in the book now. How many chapters in total are there? Because there is... Because there's quite a lot of fairy tales, like, in the back of this as well. There we go. I believe I did dog ear the last page of the book. I'm to blame for my late appearance. Yeah, exactly. It goes up to 30 chapters. So, I believe it's 30. Oh no, there's 31. 32. 33. It goes up to 33 chapters. So, my last session will be 3 chapters long. I would do another reading stream a bit later, but yeah. Though, I mean, if you'd like, I could do another one a bit later today, maybe in like a few hours. So I could go on a bit of a be right back, and then we could come back and I could resume doing a few more chapters. But that'd be entirely up to you guys. You know, since you all enjoy me reading so much. A few minutes, I know. Because I'll be having the place be quiet for about maybe an hour, maybe 30 minutes, entirely depends. So I could get like an hour or 30 minutes of reading in. Oh no. I mean, if you'll be dead, there's no point. You're about to get on a bus. Probably. Well, I mean, the magic school bus. The magic school bus, indeed. Oh, I know. Instead of reading like the rest of the story, I could read one of the fairy tales at the end, if you'd like, because there's quite a lot. Uh, oh, is there a way for me to start a poll, or should I just read them all out and then everyone in chat can vote on which fairy tale that I read out loud? Another bedtime story for April. 8. Okay, we have Rumpelstiltskin, the Water of Life, Little Red Riding Hood. Though I don't think that they are actually. Oh no, yeah, they are stories. Hansel and Gretel. Three Billy Goats Gruff. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Some of these are a lot longer than the other ones. Goldilocks. Three Army Surgeons. The Goose Girl. There's Beauty and the Beast. It tells me it's an unrecognized command, so I don't think I can. Sleeping Beauty. And that's all of them. We have one vote for Little Red Riding Hood. It probably does able. And I don't have affiliate yet. I'm halfway to affiliate. I need 50. So if any of the 3 other people who are here would like to have more reading streams or would like to join me again for one, I'm on road to affiliate. I would appreciate a follow for it, if you don't mind, of course. Cheeky little plug though. It's about having fun. It's not about having numbers, but Twitch, unfortunately, is like, well, in order to do this thing that you very much enjoy for people who you enjoy talking to, you need 50 followers. I am bribing you, Abel. I'm bribing you with reading stories so that you can go to sleep at 4 o'clock in the morning. Yep. I'll read Little Red Riding Hood. Because why not? Okay, kids, get comfy. Little Red Riding Hood. The Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a sweet little girl. Whoever laid eyes upon her could not help but love her. But it was her grandmother who loved her most. She could never give the child enough. Once she made her a present, a small red velvet cap, and since it was so becoming and the girl insisted on always wearing it, she was called Little Red Riding Hood. One day her mother said to her, "Come, Little Red Riding Hood, take this piece of cake and a bottle of wine and bring them to your grandmother. She's sick and weak, and this will strengthen her. Get an early start before it becomes hot, and when you're out in the woods, be nice and good and don't stray from the path. Otherwise you'll fall and break the glass, and your grandmother will get nothing. And when you enter her room, don't forget to say good morning, and don't go peeping in all the corners." "I'll do just as you say," Little Red Riding Hood promised her mother. Well, the grandmother lived out in the forest, half an hour from the village, and as soon as Little Red Riding Hood entered the forest, she encountered the wolf. However, Little Red Riding Hood did not know what a wicked sort of an animal he was, and was not afraid of him. "Good day, Little Red Riding Hood," he said. "Thank you kindly, wolf. Where are you going so early, Little Red Riding Hood?" "To grandmother's." "What are you carrying under your apron?" "Cake and wine. My grandmother's sick and weak, and yesterday we baked this so it will help her get well." "Where does your grandmother live, Little Red Riding Hood?" "Another quarter of an hour from here in the forest. The house is under 3 big oak trees. You can tell it by the hazel bushes," said Little Red Riding Hood. The wolf thought to himself, "This tender young thing is a juicy morsel. She'll taste even better than the old woman. You've got to be real crafty if you want to catch them both." Then he walked next to Little Red Riding Hood, and after a while he said, "Little Red Riding Hood, just look at the beautiful flowers that are growing all around you. Why don't you look around? I believe you haven't even noticed how lovely the birds are singing. You march along as if you were going straight to school, and yet it's so delightful out here in the woods." Little Red Riding Hood looked around and saw how the rays of the sun were dancing through the trees back and forth, and how the woods were full of beautiful flowers. So she thought to herself, "If I bring grandmother a bunch of fresh flowers, she'd certainly like that. It's still early, and I'll arrive on time." So she ran off the path and plunged into the woods to look for flowers. And each time she plucked one, she thought she saw another even prettier flower and ran after it, going deeper and deeper into the forest. But the wolf went straight to the grandmother's house and knocked at the door. "Who's out there?" "Little Red Riding Hood. I've brought you some cake and wine. Open up." "Just lift the latch," grandmother called. "I'm too weak and can't get up." The wolf lifted the latch, and the door sprang open. Then he went straight to the grandmother's bed without saying a word, and gobbled her up. Next he put on her clothes and her nightcap, lay down in her bed, and drew the curtains. Meanwhile, Little Red Riding Hood had been running around looking for flowers, and only when she had many as she could carry did she remember her grandmother, and continued her way to the house again. She was puzzled when she found the door open. As she entered the room, it seemed so strange inside that she thought, "Oh, goodness, how frightened I feel today, and usually I like to be at grandmother's." She called out, "Good morning," but she received no answer. Next, she went to the bed and drew back the curtains. There lay her grandmother, with her cap pulled down over her face, giving her a strange appearance. "Grandmother, what big ears you have! The better to hear you with." "Oh, grandmother, what big hands you have! The better to grab you with." "Grandmother, what a terribly big mouth you have! The better to eat you with." No sooner did the wolf say that than he jumped out of the bed and gobbled up poor Little Red Riding Hood. After the wolf had satisfied his desires, he lay down in bed again, fell asleep, and began to snore very loudly. The huntsman happened to be passing by the house and thought to himself, "The way the old woman's snoring, you'd better see that anything's wrong." He went into the room, and when he came to the bed, he saw the wolf lying in it. "So I've found you at last, you old sinner," said the huntsman. "I've been looking for you for a long time." He took aim with his gun. Then it occurred to him that the wolf could have eaten the grandmother, and that she could still be saved. So he did not shoot, but he took some scissors and started cutting open the sleeping wolf's belly. After he made a couple of cuts, he saw the Little Red Riding Hood shining forth, and after he made a few more cuts, the girl jumped out and exclaimed, "Oh, how frightened I was! It was so dark in the wolf's body." Soon the grandmother came out. She was alive, but could hardly breathe. Little Red Riding Hood quickly fetched some large stones, and they filled the wolf's body with them. When he awoke and tried to run away, the stones were too heavy, so he fell down at once and died. All three were quite delighted. The huntsman skinned the fur from the wolf and went home with it. The grandmother ate the cake and drank the wine the Little Red Riding Hood had brought, and soon she regained her health. Meanwhile, Little Red Riding Hood thought to herself, "Never again will I stray from the path by myself, and go into the forest when my mother has forbidden it." I never understood the moral of the Little Red Riding Hood story, other than if you get eaten, you can be sliced out of the person's belly, which I don't think works. I guess it's a cautionary tale about wandering off where you shouldn't go in the presence of strangers, but it's fantasy. Oh my goodness. You know what? Yeah, that might be the moral. Next time I walk through the woods, I'll definitely definitely not stray from the path. I don't want that. Okay. There's like 5 pages to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, so I might read that one as well, because I like Snow White. Mostly because of the Seven Dwarfs, let's be real here. They're like the stars of the show, right? Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, in the middle of winter, when the flakes of snow were falling like feathers from the sky, a queen sat at a window sewing, and the frame of the window was made of black ebony. And whilst she was sewing and looking out of the window at the snow, she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell upon the snow. And the red looked pretty upon the white snow, and she thought to herself, "Would that I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of the window frame." Soon after that, she had a little daughter who was white as snow, and as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. Therefore she was called Little Snow White, and when the child was born, the queen died. After a year had passed, the king took to himself another wife. She was a beautiful woman, but proud and haughty, and she could not bear that anyone else should surpass her in beauty. She had a wonderful looking-glass, and when she stood in front of it and looked at herself in it, she said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The looking-glass answered, "Thou, O Queen, art the fairest of all." Then she was satisfied, for she knew that the looking-glass spoke the truth. But Snow White was growing up, and grew more and more beautiful, and when she was 7 years old she was as beautiful as the day, and more beautiful than the queen herself. And once when the queen asked her looking-glass, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" it answered, Thou art fairer than all who are here, Lady Queen, but more beautiful still is Snow White, as I ween." Then the queen was shocked, and turned yellow and green with envy. From that hour, whenever she looked at Snow White, her heart heaved in her breast. She hated this girl so much, and envy and pride grew higher and higher in her heart like a weed, so that she had no peace day or night. She called a huntsman and said, "Take this child into the forest. I will no longer have her in my sight. Kill her, and bring me back her heart as a token." The huntsman obeyed, and took her away. But when he had drawn his knife, and was about to pierce Snow White's innocent heart, she began to weep, and said, "Ah, dear huntsman, leave me my life. I will run away into the wild forest, and never come home again." And she was so beautiful that the huntsman had pity on her, and said, "Run away then, you poor child. The wild beasts will have soon devoured you," thought he. And yet it seemed as if a stone had been rolled from his heart, since it was no longer needful for him to kill her. And as a young boar just then came running by, he stabbed it, and cut out its heart, and took it to the queen as proof that the child was dead. The cook had to salt this, and the wicked queen ate it, and thought she had eaten the heart of Snow White. But now the poor child was all alone in the great forest, and so terrified that she looked at every leaf, at every tree, and did not know what to do. Then she began to run, and ran over sharp stones, and through thorns, and the wild beasts ran past her, but did her no harm. She ran as long as her feet would go, until it was almost evening. Then she saw a little cottage, and went into it to rest herself. Everything in the cottage was small, but neater and cleaner than can be told. There was a table on which was a white cover, and 7 little plates, and on each little plate had a spoon. Moreover, there were 7 little knives and forks, and 7 little mugs. Against the wall stood 7 little beds, side by side, and covered with snow-white counterpanes. Little Snow White was so hungry and thirsty that she ate some vegetables and bread from each plate, and drank a drop of wine out of each mug, for she did not wish to take all from one only. Then, as she was so tired, she laid herself down on one of the little beds, but none of them suited her. One was too long, another too short, but at last she found that the 7th one was right, so she remained in it, said a prayer, and went to sleep. When it was quite dark, the owners of the cottage came back. They were 7 dwarfs who dug and delved in the mountains for all. They lit their 7 candles, and it was as now light within the cottage that they saw someone had been there, for everything was not in the same order in which they had left it. The first said, "Who has been sitting on my chair?" The second, "Who has been eating off my plate?" The third, "Who has been taking some of my bread?" The fourth, "Who has been eating my vegetables?" The fifth, "Who has been using my fork?" The sixth, who has been cutting with my knife? The seventh, who has been drinking out of my mug? Then the first looked around and saw that there was a little hole on his bed, and said, "Who's been getting into my bed?" The others came up, and each called out, "Somebody has been lying in my bed too." But the seventh, when he looked at his bed, saw little Snow White, who was lying asleep therein. And he called the others, who came running up, and they cried out with astonishment, and brought their 7 little candles, and let the light fall on little Snow White. "Oh heavens! Oh heavens!" cried they. "What a lovely child!" And they were so glad that they did not wake her up, but let her sleep on in the bed. And the 7th dwarf slept with his companions, 1 hour with each, and so got through the night. When it was morning, little Snow White awoke, and was frightened when she saw the 7 dwarfs, but they were friendly, and asked her what her name was. "My name is Snow White," she answered. "How have you come to our house?" said the dwarfs. Then she told them that her stepmother had wished to have her killed, but that the huntsman had spared her life, and that she had ran for the whole day until at last she had found their dwelling. The dwarfs said, "If you will take care of our house, cook, make the beds, wash, sew and knit, and if you will keep everything neat and clean, you can stay with us and you shall want for nothing." "Yes," said Snow White, "with all my heart." And she stayed with them. She kept the house in order for them. In the mornings they went to the mountains and looked for copper and gold. In the evenings they came back, and then their supper had to be ready. The girl was alone for the whole day, so the good dwarfs warned her and said, "Beware of your stepmother. She will soon know that you are here. Be sure to let no one come in." But the queen, believing that she had eaten Snow White's heart, could not but think that she was again the first and most beautiful of all. And she went to her looking-glass and said, looking glass, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the glass answered, "O queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." Then she was astounded, for she knew that the looking-glass never spoke falsely, and she knew that the huntsman had betrayed her, and that little Snow White was still alive. And so she thought and thought again how she might kill her, for so long as she was not the fairest in the whole land. Envy let her have no rest, and when she had at last thought of something to do, she painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman, and no one could have known her. In this disguise she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs, and knocked upon the door and cried, "Pretty things to sell, very cheap, very cheap." Little Snow White looked out of the window and called out, "Good day, my good woman. What have you to sell?" "Good things, pretty things," she answered. "Stay laces of all colours." She pulled out one which was woven of bright-coloured silk. "And I may let the worthy old woman in." "I may let the worthy old woman in," thought Snow White. She unbolted the door and bought the pretty laces. "Child," said the old woman, "what a fright you look. Come, I will lace you properly for once." Snow White had no suspicion, but stood before her and let herself be laced with the new laces. But the old woman laced so quickly and so tightly that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as if dead. "Now I am the most beautiful thing," said the queen to herself, and ran away. Not long afterwards, in the evening, the 7 dwarfs came home, but how shocked they were when they saw their dear little Snow White lying on the ground, and that she neither stirred nor moved, and seemed to be dead. They lifted her up, and as they saw that she was laced too tightly, they cut the laces, and she began to breathe a little, and after a while came to life again. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no one else than the wicked queen. Take care and let no one come in when we are not with you." But the wicked woman, when she had reached home, went in front of the glass and asked, looking glass, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all? And it answered as before, O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she. When she heard that, all her blood rushed to her heart with fear, for she saw plainly that little Snow White was again alive. But now, she said, I will think of something that shall put an end to you. And by help of witchcraft, which she understood, she made a poisonous comb. Then she disguised herself and took the shape of another old woman. So she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs, knocked at the door and cried, Good things to sell, cheap, cheap. Little Snow White looked out and said, Go away, I cannot let anyone come in. I suppose you can look, said the old woman, and pulled the poisonous comb out and held it up. It pleased the girl so well that she let herself be beguiled, and opened the door. When they had made a bargain, the old woman said, Now I will comb you properly for once. But little Snow White had no suspicion. Let the old woman do as she pleased, but hardly had she put a comb in her hair than the poison in it took effect, and the girl fell down senseless. You paragon of beauty, said the wicked woman, you are done for now. Then she went away, but fortunately it was almost evening when the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying as if dead upon the ground, they at once suspected the stepmother. They looked and found the poisoned comb. Scarcely had they taken it out when Snow White came to herself and told them what happened. Then they warned her once more to be upon her guard and to open the door to no one. The queen, at home, went in front of the glass and said, Looking glass, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all? Then it answered, as before, O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she. When she heard the glass speak, thus she trembled and shook with rage. Snow White shall die, she cried, even if it costs me my life. Thereupon she went into a quite secret, lonely room where no one ever came, and there she made a very poisonous apple. Outside it looked pretty, white with a red cheek, so that everyone who saw it longed for it, but whoever ate a piece of it must surely die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and dressed herself up as a countrywoman. And so she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs. She knocked at the door. Snow White put her head out of the window and said, I cannot let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs have forbidden me. It is all the same to me, answered the woman. I shall soon get rid of my apples. There, I will give you one. No, said Snow White. I dare not take anything. Are you afraid of poison? Said the old woman. Look, I will cut the apple into 2 pieces. You eat the red cheek, and I will eat the white. The apple was so cunningly made that only the red cheek was poisoned. Snow White longed for a fine apple. When she saw that the woman ate part of it, she could resist no longer, and stretched out her hand and took the poisonous half, but hardly had she bitten it out of her mouth than she fell down dead. Then the queen looked at her with a dreadful look, laughed aloud, and said, White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony wood, this time the dwarfs cannot wake you up again. And when she asked of the looking-glass at home, Looking glass, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all? It answered at last, O Queen, in this land thou art fairest of all. Her envious heart had rest, so far as an envious heart can have rest. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found Snow White lying upon the ground. She breathed no longer, and was dead. They lifted her up, looked to see whether they could find anything poisonous, unlaced her, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but it was all of no use. The poor child was dead, and remained dead. They laid her upon a bier. A bier? A bier? And all 7 of them sat round it, and wept for her, and wept 3 days long. Then they were going to bury her, but she still looked as if she was still living, and still had her pretty red cheeks. They said, "We could not bury her in the dark ground," and they had a transparent coffin of glass made, so that she could be seen from all sides, and they laid her in it, and wrote her name upon it in golden letters, and that she was the king's daughter. Then they put the coffin out upon the mountains, and one of them always stayed by it and watched it, and birds came too, and wept for Snow White. First an owl, then a raven, and at last a dove. And now Snow White lay a long, long time in the coffin, and she did not change, but looked as if she were asleep, for she was as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that a king's son came into the forest, and went into the dwarf's house to spend a night. He saw the coffin on the mountain, and the beautiful Snow White within it, and read what was written upon it in golden letters. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin, and I will give you whatever you want for it." But the dwarfs answered, "We will not part with it for all the gold in the world." Then he said, "Let me have it as a gift, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honour and prize her as my dearest possession." As he spoke in this way, the good dwarfs took pity upon him, and gave him the coffin. And now the king's son had carried it away by his servants on their shoulders, and it happened that they stumbled over a tree trunk, and with the shock, the poisonous piece of apple which Snow White had bitten came out of her throat, and before long she opened her eyes, lifted up the lid of the coffin, and sat up, once more alive. "Oh heavens, where am I?" she cried. The king's son, full of joy, said, "You are with me," and told her what had happened, and said, "I love you more than everything in the world. Come with me to my father's palace. You shall be my wife." And Snow White was willing, and she went with him, and their wedding was held with great show and splendour. But Snow White's wicked stepmother was also bidden to the feast. When she had arrayed herself in beautiful clothes, she went before the looking-glass and said, looking glass, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The glass answered, "O queen, of all here the fairest art thou, but the young queen is fairer by far, as I trow." Then the wicked woman uttered a curse, and was so wretched, so utterly wretched, that she knew not what to do. At first she would not go to the wedding at all, but she had no peace. She must go to see the young queen, and when she went in she knew Snow White, and she stood still with rage and fear, and could not stir. But iron slippers had already been put on the fire, and they were brought in with tongs and set before her. She was then forced to put on red-hot shoes and dance until she dropped down dead. Wow. Imagine being just so enthralled with somebody else and so envious of somebody else that you end up dancing in red hot shoes and killing yourself. Like, wow. Like, sweetie, it's fine. you're yeah. Hmm. Yeah, I'll actually stop it here now. My throat is actually starting to hurt. So yeah, um, as a word of notice, generally speaking, the schedule on my page is accurate. to when I'm going to be streaming. So if you're ever wondering when I'm going to be on next, these will be in the morning, so you can check the night before to see if there's one in the morning, or around 6 to 8 p.m. GMT generally. If something appears, I'll be on. You're very welcome for the stories. I hope you enjoyed them. And hopefully I will see you again soon. In fact, I'll have a look and I'll arrange it now so that you're all... Jealousy is a red hot pair of iron shoes. Maybe it wasn't like a literal red hot pair of iron shoes that had been stoked in fire, but maybe more so that she was so angry she stomped around so much that she exhausted herself and died of old age. You know, like heart failure, because she was being like too stompy. And I can only assume that there's been somewhat of a time skip, because it would be weird to think of a prince marrying a 7-year-old girl. But it's never mentioned that Snow White actually grows up. Or how old she is when they put how old the prince is. Yeah. If you would like, because I know how much you guys love these things, I can do another one tomorrow. Ooh. How exciting. I will be resting my throat for like the rest of the day. I'll probably hop on Journey, but it'll be a silent stream tonight. As I normally do, aside from yesterday, where I just wanted a break. Like, I love you guys, but even I need to just chill. Yeah, tomorrow morning I'll put that on my schedule, and you guys can look forward to another 5 chapters. Ta-da! If you're not already following me, please, please follow. I will love you forever. I will appreciate you forever. And I will see you all tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your days, and good luck in school and getting some sleep. Good night, Abel. Have a nice day, Chaos. And of course, have a nice day to the rest of my viewers who are here. And I'll put my end card on for a little bit. Ugh, because why not? Goodbye, everyone.